Now look at why use an agent or a distributor. For those of you who aren't used to this, it's basically a way of testing the market and really outsourcing or selling function in these countries, because you're using the local agents and distributors' knowledge and experience about how to establish the product or service in the country. I've put at the bottom of the slide a note about confusion around titles. Different people use different terminology when they mean actually the opposite. So do clarify clearly in your proposals about what it means, and obviously the local interpretation of a label is very important. And in the IT industry, for example, one can be distributing a IT product, but also be an agent for selling the service which uses the IT product. We'll go to the next slide, please, Matthew. So as John helpfully presented in the diagram, agents basically find for the principal, the UK exporter, the end customer, so that the UK exporter remains the contracting party with the customer. On the distributor side, we'll see that the distributor actually buys the product or service from the UK exporter and contracts with the end customer. Distributors sometimes are called resellers. So if that terminology comes up, that's probably a distribution relationship that someone is referring to. So for example, in the UK, you come across the phrase Apple premium resellers. So they're probably distributors of Apple products. So on the next slide, Matthew, if we could turn to that, please. Let's look at why appoint an agent rather than a distributor. And people tend to look at an agency first, by the way, because that is an easier and simpler thing usually to set up. So you can see on those points that you've got more control over the relationship, and also depending on the product or service, you may find that you've actually got a situation where you need to be involved in the end customer sales delivery. It might be a product which requires absolutely the credibility and the quality which you need, and the agent isn't set up to do that. Or you may need the control of the marketing or the branding or the IP. So again, be flexible with how you approach the negotiations. For some of our clients who do installations abroad, they let the agent find the end customer, but then they go and actually do the installation to make sure that the customer has the right experience of the product. We'll go to the next slide, please, Matthew. So there are some disadvantages, and John raised a really important point. If you're dealing in the EU or in the EEA with agents, they do have rights to compensation if there is termination of their agency agreement. So if you are either inheriting a relationship or asked to set up a relationship like that, there are some ways to ensure that that does not prejudice your business, but be very careful. We have worked out solutions with clients. It's very detailed, the analysis which is required, and country specific, because this is an EU directive and countries have interpreted and implemented the directive slightly differently depending on their cultural view of agents. This historically came from Germany, where agents were protected because they were sole individuals, basically finding the market and making the goodwill of the business of the end supplier, so they were not to be prejudiced when they had their contracts terminated. Also, tax implications. So for example, a principal can be seen to be liable to tax in a country if they are trading through agents, so always check the local laws depending on which country you're talking about. I've put a table together here. So the three columns, you'll see on the left-hand side, we've put the issues which relate to the agent or the distributor relationship. And basically this is the view from the UK exporter. Where do they have the either control, the ability to take the choice of customer with an agent or a distributor? So that's a good checklist for you to work through to see whether an agent relationship or a distributor relationship is right for the product or service you are selling into the market. We'll go to the next slide, please, Matthew. So I thought I would give you 4 areas, which the last of which we'll spend a bit more time on in a moment. But if the first 3, researching the market, finding the right agent distributor, and due diligence, are done correctly, then the legal contract process should be a simpler exercise. So we'll start with researching the market. This is not an exhaustive list. So on the next slide, Matthew will show us that the list shows you some of the things to consider when you're looking at agents or distributors. I do see people who have taken their time and carefully consider the research have better results. It's important to look at this as almost like a partnership. It's got to lead to a positive result for both the UK exporter and the agent or distributor. One tip we've noticed is that people who treat their network as though the agent or distributor is based in the UK are very successful because they get the two-way engagement, and it can lead to additional products and services and market research coming back from the agent or distributor from their market. On the next slide, please, Matthew, we'll see that we've listed some of the areas where we have seen our clients, when they've been looking for agents or distributors, to have successful introductions. I've mentioned UKTI and their offices. We've visited their offices in Hong Kong and Singapore and Malaysia and Guangzhou, so I would very much say that they are worth visiting when you're in those countries. We've got the open to export services as well. But then we need to think a bit more widely about where we actually have touch with people, and I've listed some of the areas where we've seen our clients have success in finding the right agents or distributors. I would make one note about the chambers of commerce in the local countries. They can be very useful because they will introduce you to people who are operational on the ground. We've had good success in Poland through the local chambers of commerce there when we've been working for one of our clients looking for lawyers and accountants. We'll go to the next slide, please, Matthew. So due diligence, I've got two slides here. These are good checklists for you, listing out the types of things I would expect you to think about and to cover. You'll notice at point 3, always check out those people who approach you, especially if they're asking for exclusivity straight away, and we'll talk about exclusivity in a moment, as John mentioned. Protecting your IP before you enter the market, obviously assessing whether you've got a very, very sensitive product or a brand name which needs to be protected before you go into those markets is very important. And when you're looking at point 7 about the geographic region, we've seen people trip up where they haven't been specific enough about what territory they are offering to the agent or distributor. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And I'll explain sole agency and non-exclusive agents. You saw on John's slide that there are ways to differentiate the agent or distributor. One good tip to start with, if you're uncertain about the approach to take, start somebody else off as a non-exclusive agent, and then you can always change the relationship as they demonstrate that they are bringing good business to you. A sole agent, by the way, is somebody who is the sole agent in a market and enables the UK exporter also to deal directly in that market. So on the second due diligence slide, we'll list out some of the other areas which I would expect to be ticked in your box when you're looking at the potential agent or distributor. Communication, I think, is the key in a lot of these areas once someone has demonstrated they know that they can deliver the product sales in the country. We have found people have very good success when they have visited regularly and get the UK operation to host the agent or distributor regularly at regular intervals to help build that relationship. Also think about it from the agent's point of view. What is the share that your product will represent of their overall revenue, and how much time have they got to sell their product? So be aware of people who are trying to sell 2 new products and won't be able to give you good business. On the next slide, we'll look at exclusivity. So I always say that exclusivity has to be earned. We've seen numerous situations where agents and distributors have had overly generous to start with exclusivity provisions. So do be cautious, do consider trial periods. Targets especially must be part of any exclusivity, and a time period by which they must be achieved. and specify exactly the territory. And I'll share one story with you. If you look up the Middle East and see what countries are in the Middle East, there are a variety of definitions, and we inherited one client who had a distributor chain which covered the Middle East, and one of the countries, Libya, it was unclear whether it was in or out of the Middle Eastern definition, and that caused a lot of problems and was quite costly to negotiate out of that agreement. On the next slide, please, Matthew, we'll now go to motivation, because I think this is often overlooked. As John was saying, you want to see how you can get the agent distributor motivated. Although sales and profit to the agent or distributor are going to be their first initial consideration, we've seen that support from the UK supplier has been one of their key interests to make sure they know they're going to be supported, and regular communication and visits both into the local market and back into the UK have also been key. Next slide, please, Matthew. So now we're going to go to our checklist. So this will help you. I've put this together so that you can think when you are producing your proposals that these are some of the headings which you could use when you're proposing to an agent or distributor, or if they've proposed back to you, you can use this as a checklist to see what is covered. So on this first slide, I've listed out the areas more to do with when the contract is being formed and is being operated correctly. So is the appointment of the non-exclusive or exclusive, how long it's going to be for, the territory, and then the basic obligations and commission payments and advertising and promotion. I've listed anti-bribery, which is obviously a key concern now for UK companies following the Bribery Act, so it's important to make sure that is covered during the agreement's lifetime, and also intellectual property to make sure it's clear who owns what and what the local agent or distributor can do. Product liability insurance will obviously depend on the type of product or service which is being sold into the local market. On the next slide, I'll draw your attention to the schedules midway through that slide, and then we'll go back to the top. The schedules I always think are one of the most important parts, and I ask clients to produce those first, because that is the operational area which everyone should be focusing on, and then the legals at the front end of the contract can be put together. So here in the schedules, you've got obviously the description of products and services and territory and prices, but again, if exclusivity is something which is being considered, you would put the targets and the sales objectives around exclusivity. Going back to the top of the list, it's vital for termination to know how termination is going to work. Is there going to be a termination on notice, and what happens if there's termination because of a breach of the contract? I always ask people to set out what is the consequence of termination. So let's take an example. If a distributor terminates, what's going to happen to the products which have been sold to the distributor but haven't been paid for? Who's going to return them? Who's going to collect them? So thinking through all the consequences of a termination and what is the worst case scenario, those can be covered in the agreement. Governing law and courts and arbitration is becoming more and more important. People often say, should we go for a certain law, English law, or the law of the local distributor or agent? That can be decided. But it's what happens if there is an issue, and what happens if the court gives a judgment. Where should enforcement take place? How easy is it going to be? Sometimes it can be much more efficient and cheaper to go straight to an arbitration, providing the arbitration is then enforceable in the local market, and that can lead to a much quicker and more cost-effective resolution of the dispute. At the bottom of the slide, I've listed out some other things to think about, because each market has its own peculiarities. So if you are selling into these markets, and Incoterms are important because of the way that the import-export arrangements work, do follow those closely. If you're not used to Incoterms, I'll just explain briefly. These are small three-letter acronyms which describe who is actually going to be responsible for the costs of transport out to the local market and for any of the taxes. It's very important. One tip for you is that if the acronym does not have after it the clear destination for where the product or service is going to be delivered, that can lead to unforeseen costs and charges on both sides, which can lead to an unhappy first export experience. Interpreters and translation of agreements obviously are key to make sure that everyone is clear in the negotiation, what is happening, and the draft of contracts and the final one are clearly understood. Some countries do need registration of the agreement, and we always advise taking local law advice, particularly in areas where there are issues like we saw with the termination of agents and what would be the costs of doing so in the EU.